at first by just acknowledging Kunle. And I met him a number of months ago in London, and we quickly became brothers from another mother. And it was his invitation that has brought me here and has opened up so many new stories, new friends, and new ways of looking at this subject that I've fallen in love with examples around the world. So on the second day that we were here, when we first started doing some site visits, the first place we visited was the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Center in Oshodi. And the first thing that impresses you when you walk into this clinic are these beautiful, bright murals of anthropomorphized animals who are smiling and happy and holding these balloons that are lifting them up off the ground and floating through space. And in talking to the healthcare workers that worked in that space about what were some of the differences before you had the murals and afterwards, they said, well, children, it was often difficult for them to come to this space. This particular clinic is geared towards neurodiverse children, children that may be fearful of going into a clinical environment, and particularly when that clinical environment is very harsh and sterile, it was hard for them. And once it became a more welcoming place, not only did they look forward to coming, but many of them, and this is a wonderful indicator, began to ask if they could have their birthday parties there. In addition to just the physical environment, of course, when we put the art on the walls, we don't stop there. It is, as many of you know, working in this practice, it's also engaging the children or the patients in the arts themselves. And at the next place that we visited, which was the drug ward unit of the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital in Yaba, we were blessed by having a performance from the Arts and Medicine Orchestra. And this orchestra is quite a remarkable group of volunteers, very, very talented musicians who play in a wide variety of genre, classical, pop, native, etc. They really came to prominence during the pandemic, where they went into isolation and intensive wards to bring music and comfort to people who had been isolated because of falling ill with COVID-19. And in this case, we were in a mental health ward in which many of the patients were diagnosed with schizophrenia or some forms of psychosis. And the music had an immediate calming, focusing effect. And beyond just the calmingness, it created a sense of community. My colleague Nisha Sajnani from NYU, who joined me on this trip, led the group in a theater exercise where the group immediately fell into a call and response of imagination, in this case, imagining where they might like to go. And the group immediately fell into it and participated and began to imagine these places that they've always wanted to be at. And it showed, I think, the power of, even in a confinement, and that can be a physical confinement or it can be a spiritual confinement, of using the imagination to free your spirit, to free yourself, to break the bounds of confinement, and to see that this place of confinement, whether it's an isolation ward in COVID, a mental health ward, a intensive care ward because you've been injured, to use creativity to see the walls around you as not merely a place of confinement, but an opportunity to create. In other words, turning your prison into a womb. And in a sense, that's a metaphor for the body itself. Is our body a prison or a womb. That's a choice that we have to make. It ties into, I think, the very basic definition of mental health at WHO. At WHO, mental health is not simply the absence of a mental illness or the symptoms of a mental condition, but it's how you answer the following questions. Can I cope with the everyday stresses of life? Can I exercise my abilities to their highest individual potential? Can I be productive? Can I participate and contribute to a community? Can I find moments of joy? If the answer to all of these questions is yes, then you have mental health, regardless of what diagnosable conditions you may or may not have. And when people who suffer from chronic mental health conditions, whether that's depression or some other form of diagnosable condition, hear that, it's a liberation, because the goal then becomes not to, quote, cure oneself or eliminate that condition, but to live a happy, thriving life. And that's within our grasp at any time. And that's the message that arts has, and the promise that we can hold out there for all of us to achieve. We also went to the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, and we saw the Taos group lead an exercise in still life drawing, where a bowl of fruit was put in front of the table, and people in the mental health ward there just focused on the fruit and drew it. And I began to think about that moment, literally that still life, that by focusing on an object in front of them and representing it on paper, suddenly all of the anxiety of what we think we might have lost in the past, all of the dread of what could happen in the future evaporated for that moment, because we were concentrating on this object and representing it. And we were truly together living in the moment. And whether that's through drawing or music or theater or dance, that in some ways is the gift that the arts bring, that when there is still life, there is still hope. And that was what I took away from that experience. We also went into the arts community. We saw some galleries, and we saw the vibrant growing art scene in Lagos, which was incredibly beautiful, powerful, and technically accomplished, rich in history, rich in originality. And what I truly appreciated about it was the opportunities we were shown for people of neurodiverse backgrounds to not only draw to address as some form of therapy their own condition, but actually to become accomplished artists where their works were up for sale. So it wasn't just thinking of it in terms of a therapeutic course, but they became so proficient, they truly became artists. The autists became artists, and that was remarkable, because then we're breaking away from a disability being defined by our deficits, but instead forgetting the disability and thinking, what are our assets? Can we bring them up? Can we let them flower? Can that be how we're defined? Not by just what we don't have, but what we actually have and can be developed. That's also the power of the arts, is the sense of building on our assets and not just focusing on our deficits. That I thought was a beautiful thing. And then there were a whole series of visits to community centers, to street theater, to street dancers in the ghettos that I thought were incredibly enriching. We saw children from a neighborhood coming together in a room that was lent to this community group by a local school, where the children ages 12 to 16 choreographed their own dance. And not only was it accomplished, but and beautiful, but hearing the children describe why they were doing it, why it was important, in their own words, they said, if they weren't doing this, they could get sucked up into the gangs. They could get sucked up into the street. What did it teach them? They said, it taught us discipline. It taught us there is no mistake. There's only doing it again and doing it better. And the sense of joy that they got from building that community of a common creation was deeply inspiring. We also visited one of the first community theater leaders in one of the ghettos, who's been doing it for 27 years. And I had the opportunity at twilight to sit down on his patio in this theater space that he had created in the middle of the ghetto, and hearing his story, how he grew up in a village in the north, and his introduction to theater wasn't really theater. It was a group of villagers coming together and performing for the chief to honor them. And he began to describe African aesthetics to me, how in his view, African aesthetics, there was no division between music, dance, theater, and visual arts. It was all the same thing, just as the ceremony itself was not an artistic ceremony. It was a religious ceremony. It was a political ceremony. It was an athletic event. It was all of these things combined, that the divisions that have been created over time are less important and less relevant in that African context. And that was sort of the spirit he was trying to hold on to as he moved to Lagos in a more urban environment, in a more modern setting. And it was just fascinating to hear what worked, what were the challenges he faced, and how his own thinking began to evolve as he learned about other forms. And we talked about Brecht, we talked about Stanislavski, we talked about Pirandello, and how all of them found truthful ways of approaching the aesthetic experience in their specific contexts, following certain lines. But in the African context, all of those methods are brought together all at once. So this perhaps gives you a flavor of my personal journey in the last few days, trying to get to know your arts and health community a little bit better. But I think I'll end with one visit that brings it back to more of a clinical context, and that was our visit to the Sickle Cell Institute. Sickle cell, of course, is a disease that affects disproportionately Africans in Nigeria. 1 in 4 Nigerians carry the gene that causes sickle cell. It evolved, sadly, because in the malarial belt, diseased sickled cells happen to be resistant to malaria. So when there's a lot of malaria, there's a greater prevalence of sickle cell, because the children who don't die of malaria oftentimes have sickle cell. So it creates a kind of reverse evolutionary situation. And in hearing the clinicians talking about the use of music and arts with sickle cell patients, what fascinated me was the science of it, that during the deep aesthetic experience, during that sense of flow that we all feel, literally the blood vessels would dilate, allowing the sickled cells to move more freely in the bloodstream and not clump up, which causes the acute pain of an episode. So literally, music provided pain relief for people with sickle cell. And when you think about that, yes, that's a very acute and dramatic way that the arts can help someone with a specific condition. But even if you don't have sickle cell, what are the benefits of that kind of reaction that go beyond that condition itself? And more than just the physical effect, how engaging in the arts allowed the patients to find hope, to, even with the new technologies of using stem cell and bone marrow transplants to, in selected cases, cure the condition, to make sure that through that arduous process, you keep a level of hope, you keep a reason for going together. We also had talks with government officials in the Lagos State Ministry, talking about how we could help support bringing these practices into a policy level to reach the most number of people and the most excluded communities. And there was an interest of learning from around the world different practices that might be applied in Nigeria. And I found myself saying, well, yes, we can do that, but frankly, the variety, the depth, the richness, the texture of what you're doing here, the rest of the world probably could learn more from you than what you can learn from the rest of the world, honestly. And so that's part of my job, is to help be the communicator. But lastly, I think if I could boil down the power of what we collectively are doing and the calling of what we're doing, it gets back to this notion of isolation. And whether that isolation is caused by a disease, an act of violence, and an unequal power relationship, the sense of being alone and powerless. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, once said, "Loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most." And of all the things that we do, the most powerful thing is letting people express what matters to them most. And if they can't find the words, if the words don't exist, if they're not allowed to speak the words, then maybe that expression takes the form of an image, of a gesture through space, of a sound. But whatever it is, it's the authenticity of that gesture, of that expression, that allows us to endure and to thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was something. That was quite inspiring.